And everything in my life has very much revolved around a childhood trauma when I went through a glass door and nearly bled to death and was hospitalized and had all kinds of repercussions from that. So I'm going to go into that, and I'm going to start with that, and I'm going to go into some detail about that because they're very odd, synchronistic things that happened later in my life that were profoundly meaningful to me because of these experiences when I was a kid. So, first of all, I grew up in South Deerfield, Massachusetts. I was born in Danvers, Massachusetts, but my father and mother had recently been married, and he got a job as a surveyor. I don't know if you're familiar with the New England area. There's a Route 91 goes up from down in Connecticut up through Vermont. Well, that wasn't there at that time, and he was hired by the state to be a surveyor and work on the crews that surveyed that highway, and eventually did other things. But so that brought them to the Deerfield area, and I was growing up there. And my mother, maybe when I was about 4 years old, probably early in my fourth year, met someone who many of you know, Carol and Rose, and they quickly became very good friends. And she would go regularly over to Carol's house, and Carol would come over, but more often she went over there. And if my mother or if my sister or my father were home, I would stay with them. Otherwise, I would go with her. And the moment I met Carol, I was 4 years old, and she was never been able to have children, and she adored me, and I adored her, and that just was true for the rest of our lives. And we're very, very close. And you'll hear a little bit more about that as I go on. So my father worked for the state, and he was in Greenfield, which is a little north of there, and we would go up, and because there was only one car, and on Fridays we would go shopping and pick up my father from work and then come back. And we did that this one day, and my parents had been complaining to the landlord because the door, glass storm door would swing open, didn't latch properly. And while we were gone, he had fixed it. Well, I didn't know this, and we had some upstairs neighbors, and anyway, my sister and I were playing, and she was chasing me, and I ran, and always throughout my brief life, this door, if you just push it, it would fling open, but he had fixed it. And so I went running and smashed into the door and fell onto the glass, and the glass went through my arm. You can still see scars here. They went through here, and it came out here, and also got some cuts here. Now, the reason there's a scar goes all along my arm is because it cut all the nerves, and one of the first operations where they ever successfully grafted the nerves back together, so I actually could have feeling. And they didn't even believe it, that they had been successful, but they did do that. So this was a very, I was bleeding. Briefly, there was a Baba lover in Boston who we found out who worked at this children's hospital where I was operated on. And I just kind of asked off the top of my head, could you get my hospital records? And miraculously she did. They still had my hospital records. This was when I was in my 30s, I think. And the record said that when I arrived at the doctor's office, my pulse was thready, which means pretty much you're on the way out. And he put a tourniquet around my arm. My parents raced me to his office. He put a tourniquet around my arm. They dashed me to the county hospital where he was waiting. He had gotten there ahead of them. And they kind of took me out of my mother's arms, and I was calm through the whole ride up there, because it was this odd state of shock, and I'm bleeding to death, and I'm literally covered with blood. My mother's soaked in blood, and as we're driving past, I had this moment of lucidity, and I'd always wondered when we would drive from Deerfield to Greenfield, there was this little factory called the Greenfield Tap and Die. And I would ask my mother, what is a tap and die? And she said, oh, it's a factory of some kind. She had no idea what a tap and die was. I didn't know what a tap and die was. And it was just this mystery. And I can remember very clearly kind of just pondering this as they were racing at ridiculous speeds through traffic, and my father's honking horns, and my mother's freaking out. And they put me in the hospital. They grabbed me out of her arms, and I start screaming, and they put a mask over my face, and I'm knocked out. They put ether on me, and they stopped the bleeding, tied things off, but they could see there was enough damage that they were going to have to send me to a hospital in Boston's Children's Hospital, which is one of the best hospitals around. So I'm completely knocked out, and I wake up. I'm in sort of some kind of a post-op room, and there's a guy totally in traction, and his leg is up, and I'm just in shock. I don't know what's really happened. I'm just lying there, and the guy looks over to me and he says, "Well, kid, it looks like we both screwed up, huh?" Very reassuring gentleman. This would have been 1960. This was 1960. Yeah. I did not see the humor in it at the time. No. But so within a very short time, I'm there, alone. It's nighttime. I'm kind of completely freaked out. And who appears in her nurse's outfit but Carol Rose? And why? Because, well, she was a registered nurse. I knew that. I often saw her, when we would go over there, she'd have to be going to work or something. She'd be in her nurse's outfit. But I didn't know she was in the pediatric ward. And she didn't come specially to see me. She was on duty there. Baba had put her there. Yeah. So that was just, I just felt so kind of relieved just to see her. It was just an astonishing thing. And that just kind of shows you what our relationship was like. It was just amazing. So things went on. They took me, I was heavily sedated for most of this period. My aunt was also a nurse, and in order to save money on an ambulance, they had me transported by car to Boston Children's Hospital, and that was extremely traumatic again because there's a separation. At that time, they did not allow parents to see the children. The doctors said, well, we've noticed and if you want to read about this, there's a wonderful man named John Bowlby who did research on this. And since John Bowlby's research, that's all changed. But he was doing his research kind of simultaneous to when I was going through this. But they said, well, we noticed that the parents visit the child, and that's okay, but when they leave, the child gets hysterical. And it's very upsetting to the routine of the hospital when the children get hysterical and scream, So rather than that'd be crazy to have the parents stay with the child, right? So we'll just make sure the parents never see the child. And they told my parents that, oh, don't worry, children don't remember these. They won't remember any of this. Well, I can assure you I remember I'll share with you some details that I wasn't supposed to remember. And later, when I would tell my father things that happened in the hospital, he'd get very upset with me. He'd say, you don't remember that. You just think you've heard people tell you about this, and that's why you think you remember it, but you don't remember it. Because they were very invested in the idea that I didn't remember it, because the doctors had told them that, and for that reason they didn't visit and all that. So I won't tell you all of the events that happened, but while I was there, and obviously there's this complete sense of abandonment. I didn't have any idea. I mean, they may have explained things to me. I don't believe they did. But if they did, it made no sense to me. I didn't understand any of it. It didn't really sink in. As far as I knew, that was it. This is where I was going to be the rest of my life. I didn't know any, this is where they put bad little boys who broke the window or something. I didn't know what the deal was. And so they would wake me up to give me shots every night. They gave me rectal thermometer. They gave me blood things, and then they would give me something to knock me out, to put me. They wake me up to give me something to go to sleep. There's this kind of thing. And they did this and it was every hour. I mean, they did every hour or 2 hours, and they pumped me full. And thank goodness they did. They pumped me full of antibiotics because I had all this glass in me. My grandmother, who was a chiropractor, is convinced, and I think she's right, that there's still shards of glass in my arm because it's still very sensitive in places where it shouldn't be, at least according to her. And so in other words, they needed to put all that antibiotic in me because it was very, very high risk of infection. So I'm in there for a couple weeks, and I mean and for example, this was a teaching hospital, children's hospital. It was one of the best around, so it was a great place to be. And they say, I'm able to play the guitar. I play now lefty, even though I'm right-handed. I can write with my right hand, but I can't make chords, which normally a right-handed person usually makes chords with the left hand and strums with the right hand. Well, I can't do that, so I learned how to do it the other way around. But I still can't. I don't have any dexterity with my fingers. I can't like straighten out this finger goes out there no matter what I do. And so there were some very good professionals there, and they had these teaching things where they would take us, many of these children, and in a kind of we'd be in a line. They had these odd, they were kind of like wooden cradles on wheels. Then this was their little wheelchairs for kids, and I would be in one of those things, and there'd be other kids, and some in wheelchairs and some walking. And we'd wait in line, and then we'd go into this room, and there'd be a man with a blackboard and like a bleacher full of doctors, who these are students, interns or something. And he would point on the board and all this, and he had me stand up and see his arm, and he'd have a drawing of his arm, and this we're going to do this, and all this stuff. I mean, I didn't really know what they were saying, but they were using me as a prop in their lecture. And so this happened, and then maybe a couple days later or more, it's all kind of a blur, but this nurse comes in and says, how would you like to talk to your mother? I was like, she knows that I exist. I had no idea that, obviously if she knew I was here, I thought she'd come see me, but she hadn't. So I said, yeah, sure. So she said, okay, come on, we'll go have a talk with Mom. And she puts me in one of this thing again and wheels me into this room. This time, still there's bleachers. This time they all have masks on. And there's this big table there, and there's a big bright light over it. And there's a telephone sitting on the table, and they bring me up and they prop me up on the table, and they hand me the phone. And ether sprays out of the phone, and I'm knocked out again. This is yeah. This, I'm not supposed to remember this, but I do. Yeah, and then the next thing I remember waking up after talking to my mother. This was a very unsatisfactory conversation with my mother. And I wake up, and both arms, this arm had been operated. This was the operation. This is a very important operation. It went on for several hours. I think it was 6 hours, and it said the medical record. And they did successfully get the nerves together. They didn't know that. They could not tie the artery together. For many years, they always would go to the left hand because it's supposed to be closer to the heart, and I have no pulse in this hand. There's no major artery, so they couldn't get a pulse, and nurses would be freaking out. And I would tell them I don't have any pulse in that hand. They say, well, that's, you don't know what you're talking about, son, But, so they couldn't put the artery back together, but they did successfully sew the nerves together, but they didn't know that yet. And anyways, because I was been operated on, they had this arm tied with just strips of cloth or something tied to the bed on one side. This arm was tied to the bed because they had the intravenous thing going in. So I wake up from my unsatisfactory conversation with my mother, and I'm tied to the bed. So it's like, this is not getting better, And I just start screaming, and which often happened during this day. And they came in and they knocked me out again. They gave me some more drugs. So I was really being primed to use drugs to medicate my emotions.
Jamie, you were 4?
I was 4. It was my birthday is July 17th, and this happened around the 6th of June. So it was just at the end of 4. Yeah, I was almost 5. I got out of the hospital in time for my 5th birthday, which was a good birthday present. So yeah, and there's other things, I won't go into all the details, but those are details that are important to just kind of, it gives you an idea of why I sought out things like Jung and Meher Baba and some kind of help. And the family was, they did their best, but they were dysfunctional, and they absolutely were invested in not talking about this after I got out of the hospital. They did not want to hear about it. They had been told that it's best that I forget about it, and it would just all somehow be absorbed by the ethers. That didn't help. But so that's kind of a key event, a very and the departure from the hospital is very unexpected. Just kind of out of nowhere, all of a sudden my parents show up and they take me home. And I've always kind of had this lurking sense that I would have to go back. I mean, there was no explanation for why I was there. I knew I was there because of the injury, but just the idea that I suddenly was being taken out was just kind of a mystery to me. But I did have to go back, and I kept hearing that because I had to do checkups and things. And my grandmother immediately, she was a chiropractor in Woodstock, New York, And she immediately drove from Woodstock and started teaching my father how to do physical therapy. They didn't tell us anything about physical therapy. They're the medical doctors, but my grandmother got me doing physical therapy and got my father. It's very, very painful, very, very difficult to move the arm. It had atrophied. It was in a cast for about 3 weeks or so after that, and once it was out of the cast, everything was frozen like this, so I had to kind of slowly, move the arm and do this. And the doctors were very pessimistic that they had been successful and were, in my presence, we're talking about, well, we may have to amputate, cut off the arm, probably take it off about here, this was and they would do these things. Now, my grandmother doing the physical therapy helped quite a lot and did a lot of work on me, chiropractic work and things, and I was getting feeling back, and this was not, the doctors didn't really believe this, and they would do this thing where they would stick pins in my hand, and I would go, ow, ow, and they said, oh, well, you can see that I'm doing it. Make him turn his head. So I'd turn my head, and I said, ow, ow, and they said, oh, he can probably feel me moving his arm. So they keep sticking pins in me, and I'm like crying, I can feel it. No, you can't, son. So eventually, though, the feeling did get back, and that began a long, I always, of course, loved my grandmother, but really my grandfather was more dominant in my life, but he passed away just about 3 years later, but that started a really close relationship with me and my grandmother, and I would go to her house for the summer and stay in Woodstock and just stay with her for long periods of time, and we just were very, very close. Let's see. So that's sort of as you can see, that was pretty dynamic impact on my life, and the family was not highly functional, and I don't know how many details I should say, but I never knew whether my mother being unfaithful to my father caused him to drink, or my father drinking was why she was unfaithful. But there was not a very very dysfunctional environment. And by the time I was 15, I learned, well, I wanted to play the guitar. I loved music. It was really probably the most healing thing to me was listening to music. My sister loved the Beatles, and she got the Beatles records and lots of other records. And I also, I had a difficult relationship with my sister, and if I could kind of like the same kind of music, there was kind of an area where there could at least be a little calm in the storm there. So I loved music. I wanted to play the guitar. She played the guitar, and I tried to do it, and I couldn't do it. And then I thought, well, it'd be good physical therapy if I played drums. I could exercise my hand, and I learned about physical therapy from my grandmother, and I could play music, and that's something I could do. So I did that, and I got pretty good at it, and started playing when I was about 10. And by the time I was 15, I started getting gigs, and I was playing with a very good professional group, and ended up leaving home and going touring with them. And at 15, I quit school. And in the meantime, I also figured out that I can the poster. And I literally, I felt like an electric shock. I was shocked. I'd come in looking for this poster, and I find this, and none of it computed. It freaked me out so much. I put the books back, and I ran out of the store. It was like, you hear about Baba, Erich going after a must, and the must just takes off, I don't know, no way, man. Well, that's kind of what it was like. There was a sense of, okay, you talk a good game, you want to better yourself, and it was like the discourse is like a challenge, it's like, here it is, you really want to do something. That's how I felt. It was like, oh my God. So eventually I did go back, and I did buy the discourses. And for a while I would put them in my suitcase, and when we'd be traveling, and we'd get to the room, and I'd open up the suit, I'd just take them out and put them on the bed and just look at them, and they just freaked me out. I didn't even read them for quite a while. They just freaked me out. And little did I know, I should have been more freaked out than I was. I did not realize what I was getting into. So that's how I first discovered the discourses, and I also discovered in that same bookstore, Dow Books, they carried books by Carl Jung, and so I started finding. It was very hard at that time to find any books by Carl Jung, and I found not only books by him, but Eric Neumann and Esther Harding, who are, there are more books by them available than Jungian books at that time. And so I started reading Jung and Baba almost simultaneously. And let's see. So yeah, and there was a lot of things about Baba, especially at one point. I finally discovered that there was a Meher Baba Center in Cambridge. I was not interested in that at all. I was already freaked out enough by the discourses. I was very introverted. I'm still very introverted. I did not want to get involved in groups or anything like that. You know, kind of nuts that get together around these groups. And little did I know. Again, I should have trusted my first intuition, but so I was very shy about that. But eventually, eventually I did read the discourses, and I read them a lot, and they became an integral. I mean, anything occurred, I'll check it out. What Meher Baba was saying about that. Okay, yeah. But eventually, again, it's very challenging, and eventually I'm thinking, well, yeah, he talks a good game, but the real proof is in how did this guy live his life. Let's get some. I'd like to get a biography about him or something. So I went there and I said, so do you have any biographies? And I was very fortunate when I went there. Any of you know Susan and Daryl Smith? They had just gotten married, and Susan was on duty. They had like these shifts at the Inman Square Center from, from 8 to 10 or something, or 7 to 9 or 7 to 10 or something like that. And I happened to go, I would go there, and they printed on the door, and eventually I went there, and she was there, and I asked if there were any biographies, and she had some, but she said, really, there was the God-Man, and the God-Man cost like $4. I was like, ooh, $4. $4 in 1973 was a lot of money. But she said, I just got married, and we've got 2 copies. We'd be happy to sell you like for $1 or some $1.50. She sold me. So I said, oh, great. And I don't know how it came up, but she at some point she said she could see that I was just kind of, and I'd never seen pictures of Baba. I mean, I had the disco. There's those 3 pictures, and that's all I'd seen of him, and that "Don't Worry, Be Happy" picture. And there was unbelievably beautiful pictures of Meher Baba in that center, particularly the one that just still burned in my mind is that one where and that very big blow up of it. Of the one in Quetta, where he's like staring at you. He's got his foot in the water, and he's sitting next to a tree, and he's just very intense, young and handsome, and very intense. I mean, it's just this very symbolic, archetypal thing. It just was. So the whole place was numinous for me, just kind of glowing. And she could see this apparently, and she said, like a look. She said, we've got one of his sadras. And I said, what's a sadra? I didn't even know what a sadra was. She said, it's his robe. And I was kind of like. She said, do you want to see it? So I put it away because we're about to close, but so she took it down, and she showed me Baba's Sadra, and I was like, wow. And I said, could I touch it? She said, not supposed to. And she opened it up, and she let me touch Baba's Sadra, and I was blown away by this. And then she took me over. They're just a few blocks down. Daryl was painting their new apartment that they were moving into, and I bought the God-Man. And I started reading the God-Man, and as I read the God-Man, by this time I'd been reading lots of stuff, but I was very, very mostly fond of the New Testament. I felt very close to Jesus, and I felt very close to his words in the New Testament. And so I'm reading the God-Man, and and I'm very impressed. And at one point, there's a place where he's talking. He's at an orphanage, and he's talking to the priest there, and the priest repeats something that Baba had said, and then Baba says, you left out the most important part. It's all about Christ. You should follow Christ, you should love Christ. And at the end, Baba says, and I am he undoubtedly. And Baba says to him, you left out that part, and I am he undoubtedly. And the priest says, oh. But this kind of freaked me out, because I had never, I bought all the stuff about Avatar, but when he actually was saying that he was the same as Christ, this really was challenging to me. But Jung, because of the way he talked about myth and symbol, and through reading Jung, I was able to say, well, to kind of hold back my kind of shock about that and just say, well, what if I just read that as a symbol and take this symbolically, take it mythologically? Because the thing is, at first when I read that, I just said like, okay, that's a little too over the top for me, and but I had already integrated the discourses into my life. If something come up, I would always turn to the discourses. So I was just really in a dilemma, and slowly Jung helped me through that. So that's just an important point to me. So now the other thing about the God Man was that I read in there that Meher Baba loved Hafiz, and he kept quoting Hafiz, and I'd never heard of Hafiz, could never find any translations. At that time there were practically virtually no, the only translations were like 19th century, very old, or early 20th century, very old translations, and they were not being reprinted, so unless you went to an old bookstore and knew where to look, and you didn't have Bookfinder and Amazon like you do now, where you can just get any book you want. So it's pretty hard finding anything, and that prompted me to go to a Baba meeting, and I asked there. I asked whoever, I think it was Susan again. I went when she was there and asked her, I've been reading about this Hafiz. Where do I find Hafiz? And she said, well, Peter Booth and Hugh Flick might know. They're scholars, and they both involved with Harvard in some way. And if you go to this meeting, they might be there, and they could direct you to where you could find Hafiz. So okay. And where's the meeting? Well, it's at this place called the Braun Room at Harvard. If you've ever been to Harvard Braun Room, it's like the epitome of Harvard. It's like mahogany, these big couches, pictures up to the ceiling of some old professor or something, who knows who. There's a Harvard Divinity School. It's just, total Harvard all the way. So I go in there and I'm like, and I'm totally into Meher Baba as an intellectual. I just thought he was a spiritual genius, and which I still think. But he, I was approaching him in that way, just as like really wanting to engage with other people and intellectually about Meher Baba, the discourses, all this stuff, And Harvard Divinity School, clearly this would be the place to go for that. So I go to the Braun Room, Harvard all the way, and here's Steve Klein in there rehearsing a play for the Baba birthday called Conehead and the Barbarians. This was not what I was expecting, and it affirmed my sense that I should not be involved with these people. And immediately, Steve took a few seconds out from his rehearsal of this very important production to just kind of get in my face and say, you should go to India. You should meet the Mandalay. They're going to die soon. And he was 100% right, but it was a kind of an odd thing to hear from somebody when he's rehearsing Conehead and the Barbarians. So anyways, that was my first Baba meeting. And interestingly, I found out later that Peter Booth, who I'd been going to try and find because he would know where to find Hafiz. I did eventually, actually Carol Rose again bought me for Christmas the beautiful leather-bound Wilberforce Clark translation of Hafiz, but that was sometime later. But Peter Booth had been going around Boston and Cambridge area with Baba's books and placing them in bookstores. He was the one who had placed the books in the Tao of Books that I found. Also, interesting fact is that Baba, Newbury Street, is where the Vendome Hotel is. It had an entrance on Newbury Street and one on Commonwealth Ave, but that's where Baba stayed when he was in Boston in 1931. So, I'm just saying. So, I'm reading the discourses. It's now, time is moving on. I've met some Baba people, but I'm still very much keeping it to myself. And my grandmother died in 1977, and just before she died, I knew she had a very nice translation of the Bhagavad Gita, and I wanted to borrow that from her. And she said, well, I'm trying to clear out some things. I've got several books you might be interested in. Why don't I just dig them out? So she dug them out. She was now living in my uncle's place in Salem, where I lived occasionally before I got my own place in Boston. And then after Luther died, I moved back there shortly, and she was there. And and she had been very sick. She had heart problems and arterial sclerosis and various things. But she, got up and got out a bunch of books, and it was Omar Khayyam, and there was this Bhagavad Gita, and Sparks of the Truth by Meher Baba. And you could have knocked me over with a feather. I was like I said, we had had this intensely very close, sweet relationship for years and years. And now, I'm 18, 19, and nothing impresses me, and I'm I know everything, and I was stunned, and she was so tickled that she had impressed me, and I said, "Where did you get this?" She said, "Oh, one of my patients gave it to me." I said, "Have you read it?" She said, "Yes, that's very interesting." And I just didn't know what to say. I mean, I didn't mention anything about the discourses. It was just one of those things that just blew my mind. And so I, needless to say, I took those, but I'd never seen the Sparks. I've been to the Meher Baba Center in Cambridge, but I'd never seen that book. And I'd later also found another book in the paperback Booksmith, Beloved by Narshwin. That was another big turning point for me. Also put there by Peter Booth, I found later. But so this continued. Luther had died of cancer. My grandmother died. And Carol at that time also had moved to, Carol Rose had moved to Salem to stay in my uncle's house, and so I saw a lot more of her, and we talked a lot, and she kept, she said, by this point, I'd told everybody in my family about Meher Baba. By this time I was convinced that he was the Christ, that he was the Avatar, that he was God in human form, and I told them that. And they were very concerned about what was going on with you. Poor Jamie seemed to be losing his grip. And so Carol asked me, "So what's this? I hear you're into something." And nothing. They all just thought I was nuts, and so you just forget it. Nothing. It's not. And I just would not tell her about. I told everybody else about it. I would not tell her about Baba. And she said, eventually she kind of wheeled it out of me, and I started telling her about Baba. And because of those conversations, I said, "Well, I should get you this book. You should read this book." And so I went to the center and I got it, and I bumped into Steve and Daphne, who I knew much better by this time. And they said, "Well, and I also, having been reading, I read the biography now, I'm thinking, okay, a further way to check somebody out is someone who's actually met them. So I'd like to meet someone who's actually met." And I'd mentioned this to Steve, and he says, "Well, Darwin Shaw is going to be speaking at Baba's birthday coming up. This is in 1979 now." And so who's Darwin Shaw? He says, "Well, he's a traffic commissioner in Schenectady, New York, and he met Meher Baba in 1934. And I said, "Okay, sounds like a good candidate." So but I had to work that day, that evening. I was playing by this time with what they call GB, a general business, kind of doing weddings and those kind of gigs. And I had a gig that night, and then the next day everyone was gonna meet at Steve and Daphne's apartment, which was also, it's called 10R Boston Street. That's where Rick Chapman and Alan Cohen and Robert Dreyfus lived, and Bobby used to correspond with them at that address. And it had been in the hands of Bob ever since then, and now Steve and Daphne lived there, and for a brunch, this was actually the Baba's birthday program that year was held on Saturday evening, the 24th, and this was the 25th. There was going to be a brunch at their house, and Darwin was going to informally speak. So I have a gig that afternoon, but I'll have a couple hours. I can go there. I'll have my drums and everything in the car, and I'll have my wedding garb on, my polyester suit and orchid shirt, and I'll just go and meet Darwin Shaw. And I did, and I was very impressed with Darwin Shaw. And I remember him saying that when he met Baba, waves of love were coming out of Baba, and I felt waves of love coming out of Darwin. So it was really, I was just stunned by this. And Zoe, my lovely wife, was there. That's when I first set eyes on her, and she said, "Who the hell is that guy in the polyester suit?" It turns out only Darwin and I were the only people in the room wearing polyester. So that was the first, and I thought, after meeting Darwin, I said, "Well, if this traffic commissioner guy from Schenectady is this good, in May, and this is only a couple months hence, Audie K. Ronnie is coming to the Mayhair Spiritual Center, and the discourses are my thing, and Audie's name is all over the discourses, and I'm like, hey. So then I started going to just coincidentally, on the night that Zoe had her shift at the Mayhair Baba Information Center, I would go there and we would listen to these wonderful tapes. If you ever get a chance to hear them, 3 Incredible Days with Audie K. Ronnie. And I was just kind of in anticipation of meeting him. I was listening to them. So after this happened, I thought, well, I'll just go I was resistant to going. Steve had said before, oh, you should go to the Mayhair Center. People say it's got great vibes. I was like, I don't need vibes, thank you. I've got all the vibes I need. But Audie K. Ronnie, that was worth going. And after meeting Darwin, I was like totally charged up. So I needed to really meet Audie K. Ronnie. So I called. I said, well, how do you do that? Steve had told me about this again. And I said, well, you just call up the center and make a reservation, and they'll ask you some questions. And all right. So the next day or so, sometime soon after Baba's birthday, I call up the center, and I should mention that the night before I'd played at this place called the Speakeasy, and a friend of mine had given me 2 really, really good joints, really powerful stuff, and I was saving them, and I thought, well, I'll call up the Mayhair. See, you have to remember now, nowhere in the literature I'd read did Baba say anything about taking drugs. There's a thing at the Mayhair Center, the Mayhair Baba Information Center, that said, please do not have drugs on the center. Mayhair Baba told people that it's better that they not take drugs, something like that. So it was pretty low key. So I said, fine. When I went to the center, I would leave my drugs in the car. It was not a problem. So I call up. I'm thinking I'll call them up, make the reservation, then I'll go upstairs and I'll do one of these doobies, because this is one of my this is medical emergency for me. I need this stuff. I didn't drink coffee or anything. I just smoked pot. It was not a big deal. So I call up the center, and I say, I want to make a reservation. I hear Audie K. Ronnie's coming. I do this and this and this. And so there's certain questions. Okay, you have to write a letter. You do this and this. How did you find out about Mayhair Baba? Who's your contact? So I don't have a contact. I found his books in a bookstore. No, but you have to have a contact. Who's your contact? And I finally said, well, who told you that Audie's going to? Well, Steve Klein. Oh, Steve Klein is your contact. Oh, okay. He's not my contact. That guy, that Conehead guy, is not my contact. Not my contact. But anyways, we got through all that. So then she says, do you use drugs? So, well, no, I don't use drugs. I smoke a little pot, but I respect Mayhair Baba. I would not bring any drugs to the Mayhair Center. Don't worry about it. Oh, well, if you use drugs, you can. I don't use drugs. I smoke a little pot. That's not like I'm not like a drug user. I just smoke a little pot. And I'm sorry, you can't come to the center. What are you talking about? And I'm coming to this. He said, no, you can't make a reservation. He said, listen, if I have issue, and then she softened. And she said, listen, just say that you won't use drugs, and we'll make a reservation for you. And I said, well, I'm not going to just say that. It's not like, just, it's worse than smoking cigarettes. It's hard you can't just say you're going to quit and stop, And she said, well, then you can't come to the, I said, listen, if I have to get a hotel room and sneak onto the Mayhair Center, I'm coming. So, you either decide to give me a reservation and so she said, well, you're going to have to talk to Kitty. So now I've thought, shit, I've only met one person who met Mayhair Baba. I didn't know much about Kitty, but I knew that she'd met Mayhair Baba, and this is now my introduction to her is going to be my drug use. So all right, so she gives me the number, and I call up Dilruba, and Kitty on the phone, and which is my first experience of Kitty, and so I say, what are you calling about? Well, I want to make a reservation to stay at the Mayhair Center when Audie K. Ronnie's there. It's kind of like silence for a minute. She says, well, usually we call the gateway. Call the gateway. Gateway's place to call. I said, well, I called them and they said that I should talk to you. She said, what? And eventually she kind of dragged it out of me, just to speed things along. I said, well, she said something about, I smoke a little pot. I don't use drugs. I just smoke a little pot. And she said because I couldn't come to the center, and then it's just crazy. Oh, no, can't come. If you use drugs, can't use going to the center. So, we went through the whole thing with her. And again, I said, she's saying it, and I'm saying, yeah, but I won't bring any to the center. She said, oh, no, you have to promise that you won't use drugs. And I said, I can't just promise that I'm not going to use drugs. And I was just really getting exasperated. And I said the same thing. I said, listen, I'm coming to the mayor. I'm going to meet Audie K. Ronnie. If I have to rent a hotel room and sneak onto the center, I'm going to do it. And so, you'll have to talk to Elizabeth. You'll have to talk to Elizabeth. So this really happened. I was very frustrated by this. So, Elizabeth. So, Elizabeth comes to the phone, and she's very serious. She's not at all pleased. She doesn't know what's going on, but she knows there's nothing good because she doesn't get called to the phone. Yes, how can I help you? And I said, well, I just want to make a reservation at the Mayher Center. And again, in silence, usually we call the gateway for the reservation. And, again, I tell her the whole long story, and I say, I'm really frustrated, and I'm saying they keep saying that I have to promise I'm not going to use. I can't promise I'm not going to use drugs. There's a silence again. She says, "Well, of course you can't." I was like, finally, someone with a brain. And she says, "But you must promise to try." It's like, ooh. She's good. So and then she's. You must promise to try. Yeah. So she just became very, very sweet, and she started saying, Mayor Bob had told us that trying to use drugs and proceed on the spiritual path is like trying to drive a car with your foot on the brake and the gas at the same time. And, I couldn't argue with that, and so I promised to try, and she said, well, here's what you do. You promise to try, then you write a letter like they asked you to. We'll make a tentative reservation for you, and then before you come, you let us know what your progress is, and then we'll see about the reservation. Yeah. And so I did, and I called her up. But this, now this established a relationship now with Elizabeth, and she, from that point on, took me on as a project. I was now a project for her. So it was a great blessing that happened, and I called up later. She couldn't even remember who I was really. She said, right. And she kind of giggled. It's like she thought it was, for her it was a foregone conclusion. She didn't even, I was thinking, if I call up, maybe they're going to tell me no. Maybe. So she said. So I said. So I wanted to let you. And again, it was this awkward thing. I didn't want to be talking about my drugs with Elizabeth Patterson, but my drug use. So, but I did tell her that, and she was, good. Well, you come along. So then when I got here. Jane, the way we call her Jane Brown the First. I don't know, what's her name now? Jane Petrowski. Thank you. Yeah. So she picked me up at the airport, and she had instructions that she was to bring me to Dilruba first to meet Elizabeth. And I thought, oh, here we go. This is where she's really gonna get me now. And so we get there, and I sit there waiting for her. And meanwhile, Jane is kind of annoyed because she's got to wait for this hat to happen. And she just wanted giving somebody a ride to the center, but she's got to go through all this stuff. And they weren't getting paid at this time. I didn't think I paid her anything. They just had people to go pick you up. So I'm sitting there. Elizabeth comes in, and I'd never met her before. She's hunched over. By this time, I read everything I could find about her, and she comes in. She's hunched over, and she's just completely carries an aura of sweetness, but also stern seriousness. So she asked me how I came to Baba, and I told her a Reader's Digest condensed version of what I just told you. I didn't mention the traumatic stuff, but I'm waiting. I'm trying to drag it out because I just know when I finish, she's going to say, "So I've been using drugs. If you've been using drugs, you're out of here." This is what I expected. So she never once mentioned drugs to me ever. I mean, from that conversation to this day, she never mentioned that. So I told her this whole story, and I finally, okay, here it comes. And she says, "Isn't it wonderful how he draws us to him?" Isn't that sweet? Yeah. So then she says Carrie was her helper at that time. I don't know if you know Carrie Bills. She was there. And she asked me, so if you got any food, have you ready to go and stay on the center? I said, well, I don't have any food, but I have friends who are here who said I could have some of their food, and I'll go shopping in the morning. And she goes, oh, Carrie! Carrie! She calls Carrie, and Carrie goes running in like in a panic, as if Elizabeth calls you, you're in trouble. She says, what? She says, this young man doesn't have any food. She's like, yeah? And Elizabeth goes, oh. And she gets up and starts walking towards the kitchen, and Carrie's like, what? No, I'll do it, I'll get it. And she goes over to the refrigerator, and Carrie said, no, Elizabeth, I'll get it. And she starts pulling out food. And Elizabeth says, Carrie, you can't just give him anything. He might be a health food person. and so she starts asking, Elizabeth very carefully asks me, well, do you like this? Do you like this? Is that okay? And so she gives me a little paper bag, and Carrie fixes it and gives it to Elizabeth. Elizabeth hands me this little paper bag of breakfast food, eggs and bread and a little butter, I think. And and then she invited me to have dinner with her at one point, and when I left from that trip, I went to say goodbye to her, and I went, and she'd been so sweet to me. And I was going to say, she didn't mention anything about drugs. But the one thing she did do was, I'm at the original kitchen one morning, cooking some food, and this man comes by, says, anybody know Jamie Newell? Is there a Jamie Newell here? And I said, I'm Jamie Newell. He says, oh, my name's Alan Cohen. Elizabeth said I should meet you. So, I don't know what that's about. And he left. That was my only... I didn't know why that would be significant. I didn't know that he was the one who wrote all these things about drugs and all that. And she never told him to say it. She never told him that I'm a drug user. And she just said, you should meet Jamie Newell. Isn't that sweet? I mean, this is how she did it. So then when it was time to leave, she did many, we had several interactions that were just really very fortunate for me, because she didn't live much longer. But when I left, I wanted to say goodbye, so I had I don't know if it was Jane or somebody else, take me over to Dilruba. And I, said I just want to say goodbye, Jay Baba, all that. And she said, when I first met you, I had a feeling we'd met before, and I know we'll meet again. Which, from what people tell me, is a very unusual thing for Elizabeth to say. And we did meet again. The next year I went, and again she had me to lunch, and was just very, very sweet. And then, the other thing she didn't, and this was the second trip. It was either lunch or dinner, some meal, and there's just the two of us. And out of nowhere, she says, are your parents proud of you? I figured no, but I said, I don't know. She said, well, I'm proud of you. Yeah. I go for probably the first day. Of course, I met Adi K. Rani, heard Adi K. Rani speaking, and there's all kinds of stories I could tell about that, which was just wonderful. One thing was that Adi said, come to India. And I never had no interest in going to India. I mean, literally, even when I met all these people, I had no interest in going to India. India terrified me. I was just there, still terrifies me. But Adi said, come to India. I don't tell you the whole context, and that was it. I was there within a couple months. Just him saying, I just adored Adi. I still adore Adi. And that was it. I was going to India. But, so the second day, they say, what's going on today? And they say, tea at the Yachts. I said, what's the Yachts? Is that a restaurant or something? I said, no, it's, so I described it. So I go over to the Yachts for tea, and I'm sitting there, and this man comes in with a cane, obviously can't see. He sits down next to me, and he says, what's your name? I said, Jamie Newell. And he said, what's your name? He said, Lynott. He says, where are you from? I said, Boston, Mass. Where are you from? He said, Woodstock, New York. I said, oh, did you ever know my grandmother, Audrey Hamilton? He said, she was my chiropractor. I said, wow, did you ever give her a book on Meher Baba? He said, no, I don't think we ever talked about Meher Baba. So, wow, so this just blew my mind. It's the first day at the Meher Center, and meet someone who knew my grandmother. So then later that year in November, as I said, Adi said, come to India. So by November, I was in India. And very first day, I go to Vilu Villa, and I said, where is everybody today? What are they doing? And they said, everybody's at Merazad. I said, well, how do I get to Merazad? I said, well, the bus is already gone. You can take a rickshaw. And no, I don't think there were buses then. But in any case, she said, take a rickshaw. I said, well, how do I get a rickshaw? I said, well, there's somebody just called a rickshaw. Maybe you can, maybe he'll share it with you. So I said, okay. She went and asked him. This was Omrit. And then she went and asked him, and she came back and said, yeah. He said, fine, just go wait. He'll be out in a couple minutes. So I'm sitting in the rickshaw, and guy comes out, sits in, very serious, stern man, and introduce ourselves. I'm Jamie Newell. Where are you from? Boston. What's your name? Tom Riley. Where are you from? Woodstock, New York. Woodstock, New York. Did you know my grandmother, Audrey Hamilton? Said she was my chiropractor. No. And he did not. I asked him if he gave her that book, and he said, "No, I don't remember." He was really didn't want to be talking to me very much. And but turned out years later he remembered that he was the one who gave my grandmother that book. He had told her a little bit about Baba and gave her that book. So so the other thing, and then I'll let you go. There's lots more to the story, as you know, but more. But this is just another mind-blowing thing for me personally. One of those things that you just say, what? I mean, those two things, just that. This whole business of my grandmother being connected to these, just kind of. Yeah, I still marvel at that. But this is another one that just blew my mind. Peter Nordine, who's of course over the years become a very good friend, asked me. He said, "Oh, you're from Greenfield. I mean, you're from Deerfield, or Western Mass, something like that." And someone said, anyways, he said, "I'm really going to ask you a question. Come with me." So this was before the Pilgrim Center was open, but it was built, and they were going to open it up in the next season. And we went around the back, and there's one of those little storerooms there. And he goes in there, and he opens the door, and there's this kind of wooden, very old-looking wooden shellacked box with clasps on it. He opens it up, and it's a box of tools, kind of tools I've never seen before, with a very antique-looking decal. You know, in those old things that you use these decals, Greenfield Tap and Die. And he said, Padre has used these tools from the Greenfield Tap and Die since 1921 at Maribod, and has used them and he told me what the tools are for. They're for making on pipes for a plumber to make the threads so that you can screw the pipes together. And Padre had used these tools for all of the plumbing at Maribod since the 20s and still was using them. But one of them, Greenfield Tap and Die. I don't know. They were a big tap and die manufacturer, and they apparently had a business in Asia. I have no idea, but Padre had them, used them since the 20s, and one of them he'd used so much because it was the size of the pipes that they always used. It was worn out, and they wanted to get a part. And at this time, my sister's husband was working at the Greenfield Tap and Die. But it turned out they didn't make those parts anymore. It was an ancient set. But so that's just another bizarre, synchronistic thing. So I'm happy to entertain questions but other than that, that's my story for now. Thank you. Thank you all so much for coming. It would have been very boring for me to just sit here and tell the story without you. So thank you all for coming. Yeah, any questions? Sure.
You said there were more stories behind being with Audie on the center. Could you say a few of them?
Yeah, just like I said, I adored him. He talked almost as much as Bao did. He every day, sometimes a couple times a day, he just loved to give talks, and they were routinely brilliant. He was really a brilliant theologian. He really was, and a great speaker. He never spoke until Baba made him speak, and by the time I met him, he certainly was a great speaker, and I just loved hearing him. And there would be these interviews, and Philip Krieger, God bless him, gave me this little sign. There used to be a sign. He stayed at the farm shed, and they would when he was not, he would give interviews there, and private interviews. And when he wasn't going to give an interview, someone would probably leave, but someone had painted a little sign that said "Audie Resting." It was a piece of wood with a little wire clasp and very nicely painted. And Philip somehow came upon that and gave it to me. So I was very happy to have that. But so the point is, he gave these interviews, and I, like so many other people, had an interview with him, and I was just in awe of him. I didn't have any questions. I didn't know what to say, but I didn't want to miss the opportunity to have an interview with Audie. So he asked me who I was, what do you do, and I, trying to be a wise guy, I said, "Oh, I'm a starving musician." in India, musicians really starve. Getting off on the wrong foot here, but so we talked back and forth, and I told him I really wanted to tell my father about Baba, but he was a born-again Christian, and it just wasn't going to be. I just did not do it. And he said, "Oh, just show him the 'Don't Worry, Be Happy' card." I mean, it was without me telling you anything about "Don't Worry, Be Happy," and just talking about that a little bit, and not much else. But then I just being polite, I said to him, "Well, gee, maybe I'll meet you sometime in India," and not meaning it, just kind of trying to be nice. And that's when he said, "Come to India." And boy, again, I did not know what I was getting into. But another nice story about Adi's talks that I always remember. Many of you know Mark Murray. He's still here. Well, he was here at the time, and his hair was just every bit as long. He was not quite as colorful looking then as he is now, but he was pretty colorful looking. And Mark raised his hand and asked Adi a question and said, "Adi, I know Baba says not to use drugs, and I don't use drugs, but," and he says you shouldn't be around people who are using drugs, but I've got these friends, and I just feel like if I tell them, if I could spend more time with them and tell them about Baba, they just would, it would be good for them, and they use drugs, but I mean, I don't think it's going to influence me. Is it okay for me to be around them?" Nadi looked at him and he said, "For me, it would be okay. For you, I'm not so sure." The reaction was the same way. The whole group just burst into laughter because he was very long-haired and very hippie-looking. So for you, I'm not so sure. But there are probably other Adi stories. But and when I went to India, I went to all of his. He had these Friday talks that he would give, and I was very fortunate to get there before he was gone. Him and Padre. Padre was still there in '81, but Adi was gone when we went back next year. Yeah, Jonathan, did you have a question?
I was just thinking, you mentioned that Carol Rose was the nurse when you were in the hospital.
Mm-hmm.
Did she was nurse during that whole time? Or did that just...
No, she just happened to be there. Her job was pretty much moral support at that moment. I mean, divine angelic presence for me. It was just astonishing. I was 4 years old, and I'm alone and terrified, and there's Carol, and I adored Carol, and this only strengthened that sense that she was magical in some way. So that was very nice, and my grandmother stepped in immediately and was they kind of directed all of them, and Carol always had a difficult relationship with my grandmother, so I don't know that was a factor in that, but I know that that's true. Anything else? Thank you all. Jai Baba.